good morning, happy Friday, wherever you are connecting from. Welcome. Welcome to this open online briefing by Forest Foundation. And as you probably saw from our newsletter, this will be the last one of the season, but we'll explain all of this. What will we do today? I pass the floor to David Nabarro very shortly. He will give us an overview of what he's seeing around the world, being on crisis and on COVID, I wanted to say, and multiple crises that are impacting all over the world, before opening the conversation with you to reflect on the status of the world, but also the form of leadership that we ought to exercise when we try to change the world, I suppose. Greetings to all of you. Welcome, welcome. Colleagues are connecting as I am speaking. But without a long ado, I would like to invite you, David, to tell us what's on your mind today.
Thank you very much indeed. Hello to everybody. It's really good that we have managed to come together today, and I'm also delighted that several of those present are people who come quite regularly to our sessions. A particularly warm shout out to John Atkinson, our colleague and our mentor on living systems leadership, who I think is on leave at the moment. It's excellent that you're here. Special shout out also to James Ritchie, who's retired from the International Union of Food Workers, but is here. And this is an auspicious day because there's just been, after many, many years of mucking around, the negotiation of some new guidance on dignified work for agricultural labourers in the context of the International Labour Organization. It's quite a negotiation, and if James has got a bit of that energy inside him, I'd be interested to know what he thinks of that process. For some people, this capacity that we have in Geneva to get all excited about negotiations of international agreements does appear to others to be perhaps misguided. But quite honestly, if we can get an agreement negotiated on something as difficult as the employment conditions of workers in the agriculture sector, in my view, it's important. Do you agree, James? We will find out in a minute. Also here, Karen Palmer, with whom we're often talking about all sorts of exciting things like Global Citizen. Claire Rayner, who's been part of the team who focused on long COVID and used these meetings to look at long COVID. Greg Parston, who's organized the visiting professors' dinner for Imperial College Institute of Global Health Innovation that took place on Wednesday. Marianne Hazelgrave from the Commonwealth Medical Association, who was involved in producing the song for the Water Summit that has just occurred, and we were going to try and play it at the beginning. It may not have worked, but we will make certain that the link to that song is in the chat. And there are other friends and colleagues here, Chris Langton particularly, and Richard Longhurst, different pedigrees for each, but they've both been with us in helping us get into systems leadership. Georgina, who's been with us on multiple issues, Megan, who joins from Africa and has been participating with us in our 4SD immersions, and Nigel Lloyd, who is a person I've travelled and worked with over the years. And this is just an effort to try to show that we are a collective of people who are committed to working for the betterment of humanity through whatever route we can. And we've, I think, done really well. So I want to start. Chris Shipton, thank you for joining us. Live illustration, really good. I want to start by just doing a very quick resume of our work on COVID-19. You know, we started our work in 2020, shortly after the public health emergency of international concern was declared by the WHO. Our initial emphasis was on trying to make sense of COVID-19 as a pandemic. And that was really important because at the beginning, this was a disease around which there were numerous uncertainties. Much of the preparedness for pandemics that I'd observed over the years had been based on models of influenza pandemics. Influenza is an airborne disease. It basically, the virus gets carried around in air drafts, and that means that you don't get these very narrow spreading spikes like we did with COVID. You tend to get a much more widespread spike across a large geographical area, even across a whole nation. And it means that with flu, you have to shift quite quickly from a focus on trying to contain the disease to a focus on trying to mitigate it, meaning that you're trying to reduce its implications for people. Now with COVID, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, because it was primarily carried in rather larger droplets of saliva or of other secretions, you tended to get the spread in a much narrower focus. If somebody was going to get the disease from me, they'd have to be standing or sitting within about 4 feet of me, and then they would get infected. But if they were 9 or 10 feet away, they would not get infected because at the beginning, and I want to stress at the beginning, this was very much a droplet spread outbreak. So we were looking at patterns of spread, trying to make sense of it, and thinking very hard about what's involved in containing. We didn't have vaccines in 2020, so we were very much left with public health and safety measures, PHSM, and the WHO recommendation was put in place whatever is necessary to be able to identify people who are ill, to isolate them quickly, to find those with whom they've been in contact in the last few days, isolate them as well, and then shield people who are most at risk because they're old or because they've got other diseases. At the beginning, masks were not being recommended by WHO. We, I think, came up with the suggestion that masks should be used quite early on, but that the style was one of containment. WHO did not recommend lockdown as the primary means of control. Lockdown was only to be put in place when you needed to buy time to put in place the necessary steps for isolating people, testing them, and then contact tracing, and then finding those who are infected. So we spent a lot of time on that. And I think we were also involved in a lot of media work, and I think we added value. Certainly, as I move around the place, people tell me that they feel that the positioning that we took, and it was often very carefully considered. We had numerous meetings and discussions in 4SD about positioning, but the reports that I received were that the positioning was appreciated because I tended to say what I felt people needed to be worried about, what I felt people needed to do. I tried not all the time to say we, implying some amorphous group of intelligent people who had the answers. And I tended also to be rather careful not to align with any particular group of people. I brought it back to myself. It has a risk because it means that you're then requiring people to believe you as a person, but it seemed to us to work. So that was our first focus: containing, making sense, and then understanding the public health and safety measures. With John, we talked about a COVID-ready state because we said this is going to be around for some time, and that means societies having the capacity to be thinking about what's involved in dealing with COVID. With John, we also said, don't try to centralize control of everybody under one particular authority and saying this is what you do in emergencies. We said, no, the best thing is to leave the various different groups who have control in that control function, but to have a very strong networked way of bringing groups together and trying to integrate them locally into functioning systems. We were not in favor of highly centralized testing and tracing infrastructure. Throughout 2020, we kept that work going. I think we were quite helpful in helping people to identify when they were at the early stages of a surge, and also in thinking through what needs to be done to get that surge contained. It was around then we started to have information, this was mid-2020, about quite large outbreaks in meat processing plants, that we found that that was because they were cold, it was because of the really quite adverse conditions under which workers were employed. We found that very often workers would turn up for work and not say that they were feeling sick, because the sick pay that they would receive, the statutory sick pay, was well below what they would receive if they kept turning up for work. So there was a disincentive for folk to isolate. There was an incentive for them to keep coming to work. No wonder there were some quite nasty outbreaks in meat processing plants. If you don't reward people for isolating properly, they will not isolate, and especially if the isolation feels like a really unpleasant place to be. We got more interested in equity and COVID during 2020. We were looking at the statistics for death rates and sickness rates among non-Caucasian people, among people in low income roles, security guards, public transport operators and the like. And we were also picking up that if folk were poorer, if they were Black, that they were less likely to access care promptly, and we were finding many bits of evidence of inequities in access to care, inequities in responding to treatment. Early in 2021, slightly to my surprise, vaccines were starting coming on stream, but they came on stream in a piecemeal way. There wasn't a nice orderly process through which the World Health Organization was able to do a simultaneous assessment of lots of different vaccine candidates and offer suggestions. And in fact, there was real uncertainty about what the vaccine assessment approach was. There were both conventional vaccines like the Oxford-Zeneca one and also Oxford-AstraZeneca one. And there were also some new vaccines made out of messenger RNA as the antigen. There were two in particular. One produced by Moderna and the other one produced by the company Pfizer. And these were clearly really quite effective, and the early suggestions suggest they were good, but there was confusion at the beginning of these vaccines becoming available. What was the indication? Were they for preventing severe disease and death among people who were highly exposed, or were they to be used for trying to reduce the spread of the virus across the population? We were very clear, and WHO was very clear, I think. I mean, they must have been clear enough, but the message didn't get across that these vaccines were primarily for preventing severe illness and death. They were not for trying to get rid of the virus in a population. So we often said during these briefings, there's not a case for giving vaccines to young children who've got a very low risk of any adverse consequences. And we need to be very careful not to be recommending them inappropriately. But we got very exercised in early 2021 about the inequities of vaccine access. We felt that it was really unacceptable for rich nations to be saying, you've got to be vaccinated if you're going to come into our country, but then at the same time, basically trying to clean up all the availability of the vaccines, in some cases having 5 or 6 or 7 times as much vaccine in cold storage as was actually needed. And then poorer countries who had subscribed to the COVAX facility that was set up at the request of the wealthy nations, just unable to get the vaccines they want. It was dark days in COVID, that period in the early 4 months of 2021. And I don't think that, frankly, that people in poor countries will be quick to forgive the rulers of wealthy countries for the way in which they contributed to such inequity on vaccine access. New treatments became available, and in particular, the use of dexamethasone to prolong life and reduce suffering was something that came through quite early. But we didn't have many antiviral treatments until well into 2021, when Paxlovid came available. Also in 2021, new variants were coming on stream. And what was important there was that the virus was gradually shifting the part of the body where it was causing trouble, from being low down in the lungs and really coming up in these large droplets when people were having horrible coughs and needing ventilation, often lying on their tummies in hospital with ventilators pushing air under very high pressure to get them to breathe, and the recovery after ventilation was low, and the depression and other sequelae after ventilation were high. Gradually, the pattern of disease shifted to infection higher up in the lungs, and then in the upper part of the respiratory tract, in the trachea, and in the bronchi, so it was bronchitis and tracheitis. And then the kind of droplets that were coming out that were spreading the infection were much smaller. And then gradually in 2021 and early 2022, it was clear that this was shifting from being a droplet-borne disease to an airborne disease. I think in WHO that shift was recognized, but there was quite a dispute with WHO people, with the airborne lobby saying, come on, you should have made the decision earlier. But I think WHO was right to be slow, because airborne was not the primary means of spread. And the trouble when once you've got something that's airborne spread, then things like physical distancing don't make a huge amount of difference. You end up concentrating on ventilation, and the cost of ventilating schools and other premises to deal with the ventilation challenge and the airborne challenge would have been huge. It's a very difficult time. Also during 2021, early 2022, as these new variants emerged, the particular one that was exciting was Omicron, much more transmissible, much less severe in terms of disease. And that was the beginning, really, of the calming down of the pandemic. But we have to remember China was an outlier, and China got its very bad COVID outbreak in 2022. And there was a lot of uncertainty then. Would nasty variants come out? Right now, public health emergency of international concern has come down. WHO has said it's no longer the case. And we've shifted to a situation where it's still a nasty virus. It's still causing quite a lot of deaths every month, you know, in the thousands, but it's not seen to be a major cause of a major need for an emergency. But long COVID, new data out this last week, most definitely affecting about 10% of people who get COVID, with all sorts of nasty sequelae for the people who've got it. Plus, in addition, evidence that after COVID, people have a much higher incidence of quite a lot of conditions, but particularly blood clots and mental illness and emotional lability. That's my brief summary of what we've done. We're trying to actually go through all these open online briefings and chart how the ideas emerged, chart how we were able to match or to be distant from the prevailing narrative, and to try to show why living systems approaches were so important. Now, we've said over the years that COVID has actually added to inequities in society. It's revealed them and it's made them worse. And you could say, well, what else has this led to? And the answer is that the UN Secretary General takes the view that the way in which the world responded to COVID has actually contributed to the global crisis that we now have at the moment. It wasn't COVID on its own. It was the combination of COVID, disturbing trade, disturbing travel, and really upsetting many of the interrelated aspects of societal systems, combined with the shocks associated with multiple conflicts, combined with the shocks associated with climate change, and more recently combined with the war in Ukraine and all its sequelae, actually contributing to what's been described by the UN as the largest cost of living crisis in a decade. And when it started out, it was widespread inflation, high food prices, and really a global phenomenon of discomfort. But now it's a year since this crisis really got bad. And what have we seen in the last year? Answer, it's moved to becoming a crisis where the position of poor people in all societies everywhere is getting worse, because life for poor people is really more unpleasant in terms of opportunities for employment, access to food, access to health, access to education. But paradoxically, life for rich people has got better. It basically, the gap between rich and poor, both in the wealth gap, but also the trust gap, the access gap when it comes to accessing services and facilities has just increased. The widening gap between rich and poor, it's difficult to know what the divide is, but right now in the UN Global Crisis Response Group, the statement is that there are 100 plus countries where the situation is particularly bad, and that there are tens of millions of people who are experiencing worse food insecurity, worse energy insecurity, and worse financial security than a year ago, and certainly much worse than 2 years ago. Right now, the UN's view is that the root cause of all the problems is that everything is stacked against poor nations and poor people, particularly the international financing system, which is supposed to be designed to help countries out that are getting into debt and getting into trouble. But right now, there are 50 countries in debt distress that cannot get help. And there's a lot of talk and action and noise about reforming the way in which the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the regional banks work. And the UN Secretary General is hard at work pushing it. There's a change in leadership in the World Bank with a new leader coming in, former head of MasterCard. And you would have thought that there will be a fairly rapid shift to sorting it out. But the trouble is that the rich nations, the ones that are in the G7, are not yet ready to change the rules about which countries are eligible for debt relief and what form that debt relief should take. And so it's a very odd standoff between a recognition that the world financial system has got to change, but at the same time, it's not yet changing. And so there will be a lot of noise about this at the financing summit that President Macron is organizing in the coming month. There will also be big noise about it at the UN General Assembly in September, at the World Bank IMF autumn meetings in October, and then on into COP28 in the UAE in November, December, and a lot of other points. And there's a big move by many NGOs and a number of foundations to try to do something about this, a campaign by One and Global Citizen and others about the need to really revamp the debt architecture. That's the Global Crisis Response Group. And I want to stress that the situation is not better, but at the same time, unfortunately, the consciousness about the situation is not widespread. We have 7 countries with famine-like conditions at the moment and likely to get worse. In all this, are there any green shoots? Well, talking to the people in the UN, there is big anxiety about something called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That's the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the goals that the world is working towards by 2030. There are 17 of them. And one of them, the Zero Hunger Goal, goal number 2, has been at the center of our attention in 4SD because we were involved in supporting the first ever Food Systems Summit in September 2021, organized by the UN. And our job was to help people in countries get a first-hand feel about what working with food systems actually might feel like. And to do that, we stimulated widespread dialogues, multi-stakeholder dialogues in more than 150 countries to explore with different groups in society where food systems might go in the future. Trying to take the issue away from all the lobbyists and the people who basically wanted to keep things as they were, and say, let's just ask ourselves, what is the right kind of food system in terms of its capacity to nourish, its capacity to look after the environment, its capacity to be good for climate, its capacity to be good for the workers, like I just mentioned, food workers earlier on, and to be good for women and young people. And it's very interesting that once you start looking at food as a systems issue, it immediately gives you a much wider angle on it. Food touches everything. It's not just about ministers of agriculture. It also gives you an opportunity to look at food using different scientific disciplines. You look at it in an interdisciplinary way. And then you look at food across different sectors of government, perhaps 7, 8, 9, 10 ministries instead of just one. And then you look at food in a way that engages different stakeholders. You always bring the farmers and the food workers into discussions, and the consumers, of course, and particularly women consumers. And then you look at food as an issue in all levels of a country, not just at the capital city with the rich people giving their view and then others having to just follow suit. And you look at food in the short and the long term as an issue that is really having to be dealt with in acute problems like people being starving and hungry, and in the longer term trying to get towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We found that if we do food like this, it actually becomes an issue that enables us to look at the whole spectrum of the 2030 agenda, all 17 SDGs, and we see food as a really exciting means to bring about change. Well, it's now 2 years since that summit that I talked about, and 4SD has been engaged to help support countries as they review progress and come up to a stock-taking moment in July this year, nearly 2 years after the summit. And it's just wonderful. We've just had a week of listening to people from countries talking about what they do. More than 60 country people came together. And although you sometimes hear people say, oh, well, nothing changes, that certainly has on food. It's not everywhere, and it's a long way still to go. But there is, in most of the countries that we've been to, a really wonderful new way of looking at food and putting it within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Within 4SD, we've turned into a foundation. Our foundation is committed to teaching people to be living systems leaders, influenced by the work of John and the work of Mara and Rogers. We've absorbed this way of thought, action and leadership into our DNA. And we're having some challenges as we reposition ourselves to be a living systems leadership organization. We're producing a lot of written material, case studies, and we're going back to doing our 3-day signature immersions that one or two of you have heard about. We're going to stop doing these online briefings for a bit while we work out how we can become a foundation that's dedicated to supporting living systems leadership. And part of what we'll be doing as well is bringing that thinking into Imperial College, where I have a role, and we will start a community of practice in living systems leadership at Imperial College in their International Development Hub. By that time, we should be back to doing these sessions again. We need to think a bit about what we're going to do, but our interest will be, and TWE is sending around a survey about this. Thank you, TWE, for all your leadership on the communications part of 4SD Foundation, because we would like to know from you, what do you find useful? There is a cost to us to doing these kinds of things. We love doing them, but we want to be sure that what we're doing touches something that's useful to you and gives you access to thinking and collective intelligence that you can apply elsewhere. And when we go round in the group now, and Florence takes you around, let's please have a good think about that. Short comments would be really appreciated. So thanks for the chance to give you this little update. Thank you so much for being with us on the journey so far, and very, very, very honoured that you're all with us, and that 4SD people have maintained this connection throughout. Everybody from inside 4SD loves these loves these OOB moments. Back to Flo, our Managing Director.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you, colleagues, for an already lively conversation in the chat. TWE has posted the link to the survey, and there's already IDs being checked there. I would like us to invite Chris Shippen to share his picture or ongoing picture. We are so grateful for all your accompaniment of those OOBs. Thank you, Chris. Interesting, from COVID to the SDGs. And then please do manifest yourself if you want me to give you the... Chris, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Well, the summary just brought back the memories, David. So I'm not sure if I want to say thank you, actually, because it was pretty awful, wasn't it? Even in the sort of comfortable, rich countries, it was grim. watching it all happen. And I just think, you know, for me, the briefings that you delivered throughout all of that, and all the scribes who did them, it was like a kind of anchor point that helped us keep our sanity, I think. And you know, I just so if it comes to, you know, what can you do for me, I say, well, you know where we are. If we can do anything for you, just let us know, basically.
That's a beautiful one. Thank you very much, Chris. We will take time at the very end to look into your picture again. David, you want to comment?
No, I want to try to keep quiet. I mean, yes, it is actually very important for us to hear from people like Chris where we were helpful. Occasionally people tell us, you know, listening to you saved our company millions, or listening to you helped us with our workforce, or listening to you helped us with strategy. And although you might think, wow, that's pretty obvious, it has a very, very valuable impact on us. So what Chris has just said, really important.
Can't agree more, indeed. Thank you, Chris. David, when you were opening, or when we were opening, you were inviting James Ritchie to share a bit more about some work at the ILO, but maybe a general comment. James, would you kick off a round of comments for today?
Yes, well, thanks very much, Florence, and thank you, David. And it's some time since I've been on this forum. As David said, I've retired and moved back to New Zealand, but I've found that retirement is a very relative sort of concept. And so I'm currently back in Geneva, having been invited to the WHO meeting on preparedness and resilience for emerging threats, which was a meeting of civil society, which is an extremely good meeting, actually. I was very, very pleased with it. And I'm currently back at the International Union of Food Workers for a few weeks leading up to our global congress, which is soon. So congratulations, David, on your recent honour. Well deserved. I'm proud of you.
Nice.
And I also say about these forums did anchor us during the pandemic. I thought they were fabulous. And I also have to say that the work that we did with you, David, and the rest of the team at 4SD on meat processing plants, there is nothing I'm prouder of concerning the work I've done in my whole career. And that work protected the health and saved the lives of many, many vulnerable people. Yeah. And so it's just, you know, it's so good. And I want to thank you for the work we did on that. Just very briefly, yes, at the International Labour Organization, there has recently been guidelines developed for decent work in agriculture. I wasn't up there myself, but I was peripherally involved. What happens, of course, for agricultural workers around the world, often in many jurisdictions, they are outside the scope of labour legislation. They're actually excluded from having access to basic rights like the rights of freedom of association, collective bargaining, forced labour, child labour, and the rest of them. So what this discussion was aiming to do was to bring those rights to the forefront of governments, to say, no, these workers should have access to rights like everybody else in the world, like every other worker in the world. And that it's no accident that some of the world's poorest people are the same people that grow the world's food. Whether they be small farmers, whether they be agricultural workers, they are some of the most vulnerable and poorest people, and they're most vulnerable to the climate crisis. They're going to be shifted off their land and have to, you know, the migration of this century is something that we can hardly comprehend. And at the same time, we have Fortress North America, Fortress Europe, and something's got to give. And what David said about, you know, we need debt reform. We also need full reform of global taxation regimes to reduce inequality and those things. So all of that's been very important. So we did get a document out of the ILO. There's a lot of work happening up there at the moment on just transition, around climate crisis, around decent work, about trying to bring labour standards into supply chains. So good work, but the enforcement and the work and the organisation around that goes on all around the world is incredibly important to this, in terms of reducing inequality, being better prepared for the climate crisis, being better prepared for all the risks of future pandemics as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
So very important that there's been some progress on this. And I find your point about enforcement is really relevant. I was just traveling in Africa a week ago and listening to farmers, and it's quite clear that the follow-up and enforcement of laws on workers' rights in the ag sector is just not good. Thank you very much, James. Don't give up, ever.
Definitely. I think very touching but troubling to hear you saying that the piece of work that Forest Foundation did on meat producers and COVID being so impactful. So that I find touching, troubling that nobody else or no other bigger organizations took that topic in hands. I find, anyway, that's how it is. But thank you, James, for emphasizing this. More comments for today. There's a lot in the chat. Keep commenting, please, there. But I'm curious, I was trying to encourage Joe Nichols in particular. You've been with us, with David, for a long, long time in those OOBs all along. Any thoughts, Joe, you would like to share with us today?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I mean, I think what David said at the beginning about it being a kind of honest space to reflect on what everybody thinks has been hugely important. And I personally really appreciate the fact that the messaging is owned rather than the amorphous we, which I find quite hard to process, because it means that it sort of implies you're not expected to interpret things within your own community and according to the knowledge and the extra information that you have about where you are. Whereas when it's portrayed as David's understanding or the team's understanding, it's very clear where it comes from. And the ability to feed in about the different things that are happening in different countries around the world as well, I have found really interesting to listen to other people. And I'm hoping that by being able to share some of the challenges we've faced in East Africa, that's also been useful to other people, because certainly things like food systems, certainly things like climate change are such enormous issues here. And this has really brought home how interlinked everything is. And how important it is to try at least to begin to address things simultaneously. Thank you.
This is beautifully said. Thank you so much, Joe. David, you want to comment on Joe's remarks?
One of the reasons why I'm really keen to bring living systems thought and working and leadership into Imperial College is that I'm more and more finding that universities are trying to find ways of teaching the science of interconnected working. One challenge that everybody has is that, and found this in Pretoria when I was there, was that they all say, yes, we need to work across disciplines, but then in the next breath it is, but we can't find the time to do it because all the coordination takes forever. And so one ends up with a sort of limbo situation of people saying, yes, we've got to find ways to do it, but then saying it's not feasible in practice given the pressures on our time. So what I'm interested in is techniques that encourage interconnectedness, but are not massively time consuming. I think that's a researchable area. And I would love it if anybody here is either in touch with people who are looking at that sort of stuff or interested in that sort of stuff. Please be in touch with us gently on the chat or in an email to TWE, because I think we'll have to do some work on that. If we set up this community of practice, which I plan to do with Imperial, in September. That'll be one of the issues that we look at.
Very interesting. Thank you, Joe and David. And John Atkinson, our 4SD systems mentor, is also inspired to reflect with us today. John, please.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you, and thank you, David, as well. Yeah, I've been away from the coalface for a little bit, so my brain goes in interesting places, or to me at least. But listening to the conversation, it struck me that there's something important in it that we need to hold on to. Normally, when we look at topics, we look at it from a reductionist perspective. We get more and more specific. We drill down into what's really going on, what's the science behind it, and the effect of that is we create technical excellence. We create people who are really brilliant at that field in that topic. But the cost of that is we start to disconnect from other people and the population probably more broadly, and also from other subjects and other topics. And what we need in a systems approach is obviously a broader, more interconnected way of doing things, because then we can see the issue in the environment in which it takes place. Living systems have a characteristic of symbiosis, and we lose that when we burrow down in. So, David, it won't come as a surprise to you. It certainly won't come as a surprise to Florence that the perspective that I take that's always helped move through that is not to spend time trying to persuade people who are very busy in their technical excellent fields to do things together, because as you say, there's always, well, we just don't have time for that because I'd love to, but it's an add-on. But instead to change the focus through which we look at it. And the focus that I've used over time is to look at it through a geographic area, through the lens of a place that therefore puts the health of the population, the wealth of the population, the housing of the population, the nutrition of the population, the climate in that place, the industrial history of the place, whatever else it is, all into the same mix. And you can build a story that says this is what's going on here and this is the trajectory we're on, and how might we, if we all wanted to do it, write a more positive and better story for the future. And I think that's what's necessary. And that's why when I saw the comments about the SDGs and targets not being met in the chat, that's why I'm always reminded, David, that you speak at times about the latter of the SDGs, I think 16 and 17, which focus on how are we going to provide the infrastructure, the mindset, the institutions that enable us to look across that broad perspective, because all the SDGs interlink with each other. And this diving down a technical focus or a particular interest in one or the other produces the expertise necessary perhaps to make a step forward, but lacks the thing that's needed to really make the whole thing work. So that was where I was going with it, David. And Florence, thank you for inviting me in.
But John, the enormity of the task is what continues to really smack me in my face. There are lots of people who are very good at the deep dive type approach and the technical way of working. There are relatively few people who are comfortable with the mindset needed to knit institutions together and to weave narratives out of their different approaches to science or to sense making. So all I'm just thinking is, gosh, we need an awful lot of people working on the living systems approach if it's going to percolate through and lead to the different way of thinking that's necessary. Do you get depressed about that?
Sometimes, and then at other times I remind myself that in most places around the world, if not all places around the world, there are people already doing it in different ways for their communities, probably at local scale more than global scale. When it gets to national or global scale, it just becomes a show to most people. It's hard to make the connection. But at local level, you will find people all over the place who are just finding the person they need to find to get the water fixed, finding the person they need to find to get the electricity fixed, getting people connected around how do we get stuff to market. It's going on already at a massive scale, and it doesn't get the credit because it's not a discipline, if you like. So at times it's depressing because it seems overwhelming. At times it's exhilarating because you think it's already there. Everything that's needed is there.
So it's all about how stuff really gets done. I was thinking about that when talking to a group of students about it quite recently. who are the people who you really admire for the way in which they get things done? Answer the people who are very good at living systems leadership. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. And I think it's an interesting segue also to give the floor to Iman Ahmed. You might remember, so many of you were there when Iman was giving us a very sobering vignette a few weeks ago. Iman, lovely to see you today. You seem to be on mute though.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, David, and all SD team for this successive series. I think by sustaining all of us around, I wouldn't even say around the table, it felt as a community, and I think that's a testament to how we appreciate the innovative approach. That is very much, it felt like a community, and you started it at a unique time when people were under lockdowns around the world. So that itself added to the innovation of bringing people together. You've maintained this horizontal leadership throughout, and horizontal nature, I would say, of this forum. And there was a balance between bringing in information, yet every one of us contributing. We stayed truthful to our concerns that we brought from where we lived, from where we were connected, and from our experiences in bringing our concerns and so on. I wish to also contrast this with I mean, it's kind of I've been working in humanitarian coordination, and I've seen the models of coordination around the world emerge with the cluster approach and so on. Yet still, I do believe that these have not yet broken the silos in an effective way, and have to a large extent consolidated leadership in under pillars and specific organizations, and at times even personalities. So what we bring forward here, and I appreciate not only the inputs of John, but also recentering us around systems thinking and bringing us back to the wider platform, and how we can connect things together without breaking into silos, without creating that pyramidal leadership. In the future, I appreciated that you David, mentioned the need to discuss topics beyond COVID. That's definitely something I agree with. I mean, the older ways are definitely not working, of bringing an expert and then people listening and then making comments and so on. The second point is, during COVID, we used to say, think globally and act locally. And that was very useful and helpful. I think we could flip that around and start to learn from the local experiences even more, and bring the models of working together, the models of systems integration and systems approaches from the communities. I think John also gave good leads on that. Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure being part of this community.
Thank you, Iman. David, we hear you ready to jump. So jump.
No, I just want to thank Iman Ahmed for her leadership in so many ways. In Gaziantep, as she told us, she really had to switch into a different gear when the terrible earthquake happened. Iman, I can't tell from looking at your image whether you're still in southern Turkey or whether you've come back across the Atlantic. Whatever it is, you must have had so many experiences that it will have changed your life. I know you say that you've done several humanitarian assignments over the years, and I'm sure that each one has had a pretty massive impact. But just I hope we don't lose touch with each other, and that I can continue learning from you. Thank you again for being connected safely back home. Excellent.
Thank you, my pleasure. Would love to stay connected.
So just to say, we're coming to Canada. We'll be in Toronto area mid-June.
Oh, great. I'm around. Would love to meet you.
Okay,
We'll
fine.
connect. Thank you,
Right.
David. Bye.
Right. Mm.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you, Iman. More comments in the chat. If you would like to put words on your comments, just wave your hand. Who would like to share more thoughts on what you found useful here? Karen. Yes, we talk about Canada, so please do come in.
Yeah, I'm on the other side of Canada, far away from Toronto, but nonetheless, I think what I've appreciated most about this group is the unfiltered authenticity of just hearing from real people in real time, in places I've never been, places that I might read about and wish to go, but I think that's really, really mattered. This is not a media report. This is not somebody's interpretation. It's just what people in those places have to say. And I think that authenticity, again, and the transparency, sometimes really radical transparency, has been very useful, and helps us to see the world as one place and not these sort of siloed jurisdictions in which we happen to live. So I'm grateful for that. And I hope that there's some way to continue with this momentum. I think once you let a group dissolve, it's hard to pull it back together. So, maybe there's a way to periodically even pull this group and others who wish to join it into the same space again.
Thank you so much. We definitely don't want to lose the group nor lose the sense of community, and with TRI we are thinking through various options to stay connected while we are sharpening our approach for those briefings. So thank you for all the suggestions. Thank you for raising your hands, including those who do not find their hand. So I will squeeze Sarah Phillips in between Rebecca first, then Sarah, then Marianne, then Annie. Rebecca.
Yeah, it's honestly hard not to get emotional, because this really was an anchor, I think, for a lot of us. It made me think back to when I was seriously locked in my house for months. And I just want to say thank you, as I've said every time, for giving us the space. I mean, I really think that's what's been the most useful, and it reflects so many comments that people have said today, and other times, that it's literally just been an unfiltered space full of trust in each other and honestly strangers, and now we're not strangers. And I think you can't, as I said in the chat, you can't put a price on a community such as this or any other community that's like this. Yes, you can do work in communities and community organizing, but oftentimes those people, as have been alluded to in other comments, have worked together before. There's some common thread where they know someone, but at least I can honestly say that I didn't know 99% of the people in here when I first started coming, and now I feel like we're a community. And it makes me think about how to do this type of work on a broader scale, because of course I can connect with many people within food systems. Yes, that is a broader group, I'd say, but it's still not the same as using this specific community as example. There's people in here that don't work so directly on food systems as I do, and yet we all need each other to come together. That's what the SDGs are about, without saying it. I think John or someone else said that in the chat. We need to bring all the living systems together, and so these spaces become even more important and invaluable, not just across academics or certain sectors, but bringing these different sectors together, I don't know how else we'd have these type of opportunities. If there's a way to even grow this type of model, to be connected to people who have had such broad and rich experiences within their own interdisciplinary transdisciplinary work. That's the thing. A lot of the people in here also do inter and transdisciplinary work, but it's different amongst us all. And so we've just, I really think, built an incredible hive, as we've talked about. And again, just want to say thank you.
And big thanks to you, Rebecca, and everybody sending you big hugs and hearts. You comment the authenticity of David, in particular, the 4SD team in supporting this space. But I think you, and you, Rebecca, in particular, but many of the participants here, you came here with raw emotions that you dared sharing with each other, the cries and the laughters, and not being too anxious of the judgment by the others. And I think you've made the style and the spirit of this space as much as David shaped it. David, any comments before we have a fire of reactions by Sarah, Marianne, and Annie?
Just, I think that for many of us, the safety of this space matters. I mean, it's two things. It's a safe space, which means that we can actually share, and we can share our feelings if we want to, knowing that we're not going to be in any way discriminated against for doing so. But it's also a space where I think we are respectful of others, and we think carefully before we speak. So we don't just say any old thing. There are really skilled and seasoned professions here on the screen in front of me, and it's the fact that it's a considered space as well as a safe space that I really like. And Rebecca, I remember us being together in The Hague or Utrecht or something, and we were just chit-chatting. We'd been connecting through these sorts of means, and then suddenly we were together, and it was just an absolute wow, because we realized how much we'd progressed by being on teleconferences, and then we will never, ever feel that we need to reinvent our relationship. It's just there. Thank you for that.
Thank you, thank you. Let's take a series of comments. Keep your comments short if we can hear from many of you. I was promising Sarah Phillips.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and lovely to hear from Rebecca in her genuine way as usual, and the community and all the people here have meant so much to me. And it's the same as everyone was saying, but the thing for me that, you know, it's so valuable, and it's seen me through a journey as well and taught me so much that I'm now using in a place that I'm really enjoying, and health and leading that forward, and using the masters I have and all the things here that I've learned here to try and knock that into shape, I suppose, to be something meaningful. But I think the key thing for me as well is about the truth and the safety in a world full of maneuvering and diplomacy as well, and being careful with there's always truth here and respect. And I think that was really important. And I think that's my key. I could keep going on forever, but I think it's just been wonderful, and I'm so thankful, and I do hope to continue in the sort of next part of that double diamond that John described, John and Chris drew. You know, we got there, and now we're going to the next bit. So I'm hope to be a part of that in some way that you might find helpful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we will be with all of you. Thank you, Sarah. Marianne has a grave.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And first, I'd say thank you to David and to you, Florence, and 4SD for making this an opportunity for us. And it's in being an opportunity, it's one that COVID has given us.
Yeah.
COVID gave us an awful lot we didn't want, but one of the things it's given us is the opportunity to talk about things. And from that, it's very clear that there's more to be done. So please, David, don't actually stop now. There are a lot of issues, and you brought them forward. You talk about food, I talk about health, I talk about gender. And when you look at the 2030 agenda, Where we have been very weak is all the interlinkages.
Yeah.
Food cannot be there without the women who may be in a village collecting it, but they need the water. And if the climate's bad, then there's no water, there's no food. And what happens? The children go to school hungry. That's 4 or 5 SDGs in one sentence.
Yeah.
So we have to keep on. And whatever our issue is, that's our entry point. And one of the failures of the SDGs is we've kept thinking in our old way, which was our own issues. So thank you for this opportunity. You've taught me a lot. And I think now I have to go and do something about putting it into practice. So I've decided to do a geriatric PhD.
Excellent.
And I will start on that soon. And I hope to
Excellent.
finish it before I'm 85. I have to get on with it, but there you go. But thank you again, David. Thank you, Florence. And please don't wait very long to come back, because we should now be talking about the summit of the future, not next year. It'll be too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. We got the message. We got the message. We won't be long away. We need a little time though to reflect and improve actually, and find ways to do bigger and connect in many places. But we will come back. We will come back. Promised you. We have written it also in the chat. Annie, you want to share thoughts with us also? Just need to unmute Annie.
Yes, sorry about that. I think the big success of this meeting, David, is that we're not going away for long, and Florence has already agreed that it will come back soon, and I think that's terrific. So whatever else we think, this session's been a success, and I do want to say thank you, because it was a window on the world when we were all locked down. I think this issue of I'm going to say the negative thing first, and then I'll think more positively. And looking at the G7, I think it's awful to depend on us for anything at the moment. The internationalist thinking has gone away, and it's terribly inward looking in many ways. I mean, the UK and America are probably the worst examples. And so I'm, as with other from the UK sitting on this session, intensely ashamed of how our government behaves. And so the positive side is, yes, I absolutely agree with John, and that's what we're doing locally. I mean, I won't go into a lot of it, but we are dismantling these boundaries so that institutions work together, but it's not quick. You know, we started putting some of these roots down about 10 years ago. So I don't know whether your geriatric PhD can cover all of that, Marianne, but it is really worth doing. But it is, goodness me, it's an uphill battle. So we do need each other, I think, and I've never known you to give up on anything, David. So I'm hoping you're going to have a good summer and that you'll be back soon. So thanks, everybody. I mean, I've learned such a lot, but it does feel, even if we never, it's hard for us to physically meet. These meetings are just really, they're smashing, and I'd like to keep them going and do what I can to help.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. That brings us, I mean, we're already a bit over time. David, without being too long, how do you welcome all those thoughts? Here we are, you're writing on your screen now.
I've just discovered a little bit of software that enables me to write on my Zoom screen. And because I was just a bit worried that I wouldn't have the words, for the same reason as Rebecca was a little bit stumbling at the beginning, I was going to write it all. But I'm okay. I've not been prevented from speaking by all things coming up in my eyes. I mean, there is only one way to work if you're minded like we are, and that is through connecting. and we have to connect as efficiently and as effectively as we can. And probably this scheme that we have using a Zoom with about 30 to 40 people present is a fairly efficient way of doing it. It gives a number of the people here a chance to speak, so it feels participatory. Plus, we've got the joy, thank you so much, of Chris Shipton giving us this visual appreciation. And over time, we've all taken slightly different roles, and I think that's been valuable as well. And that's what becoming a community is all about. I suspect that each one of us will be able to say to our friends and our neighbors and our families that there are features of this way of working that have really benefited us in the long term. They've given us extra opportunities to have deeper connections in places we wouldn't normally have. So I think that my colleagues and myself are going to find a way to continue it, and we will see what that's going to be. Need a little bit of time, but this has been great. And please use the survey or any other technique to just keep us minded as to what you're thinking about. And we'll try to make certain, not just that we can keep this particular format going, but as Florence said, to find a way to expand and extend further. Big thank you to all the team. I mentioned Twee, I've mentioned Chris. There are others in the team behind the scenes. I want to give my special mention to Florence, who, as Managing Director of 4SD, has helped us bring what we've got into its foundation status. And we are looking forward to that being the launch pad for a lot more multiplication, amplification, and dissemination. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, all of you. We will look into the drawing of Chris. And just to finish, the French, of course, ce n'est qu'un au revoir. It's only a goodbye. It's only a little pause so that we can assemble our thoughts, come back to you with even a better space than it was. Thank you all for your trust, your engagement, your authenticity. We'll leave it there for today. Big thanks, Chris, for this beautiful picture. Bye-bye for now.